Hello everyone. Today we are going to discuss about comedy. Comedy is an art form which is all pervasive. It is not only a genre of literature, but it's also there in the theatre, the cinema, the films, the nukkad nataks, and also in real life incidents. So in literature, comedy is an important genre. Comedy in literature is a fictional work that is made by the author in order to entertain or amuse his audience. There are two things about a comedy that you must know. First is that characters are presented as caricatures, obviously to invoke laughter. And the second thing is that in a comedy, as audience, we are at no point made to feel that any great disaster or tragic event is going to happen. So in short, it's a very light-hearted genre which presents a happy-go-lucky situation. And the comedy or the laughter is surrounded around that. We will also discuss in detail the 7 broad kinds of comedy. First kind of comedy is the romantic comedy. As the very name suggests, romantic and comedy. So what is presented in a romantic comedy is a romance, a love affair between the protagonists that culminates in a happy ending or happily ever after. So the classic example is William Shakespeare's As You Like It. And the good part is that this term began from literature, romantic comedy, but is now extended to films also. The light-hearted films surrounded around the romance of a hero and heroine, we call them as romantic comedies. The second type is the satiric comedy. The very name, satiric comedy. So the comedy or fun is aroused from the satire or mockery that is made of the situation in which it is placed. The situation can be mocked, the society in which it is written can be mocked, the characters can be mocked, anything can be mocked, but the satire or mockery is the main thing in that. The example is Ben Jonson's The Alchemist. In The Alchemist, Ben Jonson creates a mockery or makes a satire on the hypocrisy and the gullibility of its characters. So that's why it's a satiric comedy. Another type is the comedy of manners, also known as the restoration comedy. Now it's very important to know why it's called the restoration comedy, because it began and excelled and reached its perfection in the Restoration Age, that is from 1660 to 1700. That's why it's called the romantic comedy and comedy of manners. So the manners, the fashions, the fads and follies of Restoration Age or the society of Restoration times is made fun of in this kind of comedy. The classic example is William Congreve's The Way of the World. Another kind of comedy that we must know is farce. The word farce means an unorganized, messy or unsettled situation. And so is the comedy. The comedy of a farce is not intellectual laughter or something from dialogues or something very different or far-fetched or funny in terms of speaking. It's comedy in terms of body language or in terms of the situation it is presented. So what is funny is the situation or the body language of the character. The comedy of Charlie Chaplin is farce. And in literature, The Taming of the Shrew by William Shakespeare is a perfect example of the farce. Farce is basically fun that invokes belly laughters, not intellectual laughter. So maybe in common situations, the cartoon Mr. Bean that we see is a farce because he is not giving you any wise things or any dialogues, but the situation in which he is placed and how his body language is extremely bizarre and funny. Another kind of comedy is tragicomedy. So it blends two things, tragedy and comedy. Hence the combined name is tragicomedy. So what happens? The features of a tragedy and a comedy are blended in a tragicomedy. So in a tragicomedy, basically the protagonist is undergoing some threatening situation and some threat is looming. But due to a turn of events and circumstances, the threat is reversed, his fortune is reversed, and what happens is that he meets his happily ever after, or the situation is ended on a lighter or a happy note, just like a comedy. It doesn't begin in a happy note, but it does end in a happy note. So tragedy, initially the situation is tragic, but due to reversal of fortune, it becomes a happy conclusion to the story. The example is The Merchant of Venice by William Shakespeare. Another kind of comedy is sentimental comedy. So sentimental comedy, more than arousing laughter, it arouses sentiments of the audience. Richard Steele's The Conscious Lovers is a classic example, and we must know that sentimental comedy was for a short vogue of time. It was not forever. It was in the 18th century that it centered around the sentiments of the character, and it popularized and perfected itself in the 18th century itself. And the last but not the least kind of comedy that is prevalent today is the dark comedy or the black comedy. We also call it black comedy as well as dark comedy. Now, we prefer dark comedy, calling it dark comedy, for reason because black comedy sounds like color specific or color biased. So, we'll stick to the word dark comedy. In this comedy, what happens that such situations, serious, dark and morbid topics are taken that we normally do not want to discuss. It is painful for us to discuss, or these are taboo topics. Such serious topics are taken up and fun is made out of them. So that's why it's dark but comedy. So the classic example is Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five and Joseph Heller's Catch-22. Do let me know if you know some other comedies and which is your favorite comedy type and your favorite comedy play.